Hey everyone, welcome back to Shakespeare video series. Today we're going to take a look at Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet. Recall at the end of Act 1 that Romeo and Juliet have fallen in love, or they at least meet each other at the party and have a kind of short-lasting infatuation with one another, and they don't know that each of them are part of the kind of opposite faction or the opposite family at this point yet. Okay, so both Romeo and Juliet, Romeo is part of the Montagues, Juliet is part of the Capulets, and they hate each other, but there's kind of an ironic self-conflicting love going on between them, because obviously they love their families, but they also love each other. Now, one thing that I didn't mention in the previous video is the importance, or maybe the role, of the chorus in these plays. So as you notice, at the start of some acts, there is a chorus that comes on even before the act begins. And basically the chorus is kind of almost like a plot summary. Now, this particular aspect of Shakespeare plays sometimes happens in his tragedies, and the chorus is there for a couple of reasons. It serves a couple of functions. Firstly, it serves to kind of remind the audience of the events that have happened. Because Shakespeare's tragedies move so quickly and there's so many events and little subplots that happen, okay, sometimes the audience needs a little reminder of, well, this is actually what is going on, what has happened so far. So it serves as kind of bookmark for the audience, just so they can catch up to speed, even if they were, drifting asleep, or they didn't really catch all of the previous act. But also the chorus acts as a kind of representation of, like, the gods, or the representation of some sort of divine spectator that can observe all. Now, who is a divine spectator that can observe all? Well, the audience, right? Because the audience has more what we call an epistemic power than the characters within the play, because the audience knows everything that every single character says, right? Romeo doesn't know everything that Juliet says, obviously, because he's not always in the same room as Juliet. And also the audience has access to all sorts of different soliloquies and monologues and asides that other characters can't even hear. We can basically hear the thoughts of these characters. So the chorus is almost like a reflection of the audience as well, the perspective and the kind of privileged epistemic power the audience has. And it's meant to serve as kind of like, something that the audience can relate to, something they can link to their own perspective. So with that being settled, let's dive straight into Act 2. Once again, at the end of Act 1, Romeo and Juliet have fallen in love, and now we have the aftermath of that. So Romeo, Benvolio, and Mercutio. Benvolio and Mercutio are kind of Romeo's kind of comic sidekicks, okay? They come to realize that Romeo is no longer in love with Rosaline, which is a little bit strange, right? Because Mercutio and Benvolio, at this point, they think that Romeo is just constantly miserable and falling over himself and barely able to get anything done because of his extreme love for Rosaline. So they keep teasing him about it, okay? For example, Mercutio, right at the very start of Act 2, Scene 1, names all these famously beautiful women of history: Cleopatra, Venus, Helen, people like that, all throughout all sorts of different kind of mythologies and cultures, and compares them, none of them are as beautiful as Rosaline, as kind of, teasing Romeo. And they don't know at this point that, well, Romeo doesn't really, he's completely almost done a 180, fallen out of love with Rosaline and fallen in love with someone that he should have no kind of expectation of falling in love with, someone who is meant to hate, someone from this opposite warring family. And this is kind of foreshadowed by Benvolio and Mercutio in this particular scene. Okay, come, he hath hid himself amongst these trees to be consorted with the humorous light. Blind is his love, and best befits the dark. If love be blind, love cannot hit the mark. Okay, so they're kind of talking once again about the confused, the not clear, the self-conflicted nature of love. And even though they're talking about that as a kind of way of referring to how Romeo is really supposedly tortured over Rosaline, it kind of also reflects that idea of Romeo having this contradictory, paradoxical love. All right, that was a really short scene. Let's move on to Act 2, Scene 2. This one's in Capulet's orchard. So what happens is, after the party, Romeo actually hides himself somewhere within the Capulet mansion. He doesn't leave straight away, and Benvolio and Mercutio are trying to look for him. Now, they basically almost assume that either he's hiding out to be depressed, or that somehow he's gone lucky with Rosaline, okay? And they're, off sleeping together or something like that. But what Romeo is actually doing is he's literally hiding in Juliet's garden. And he doesn't really know that at this point, but he's just hiding there, trying to get one last peek, or trying to get some sort of interaction with this girl. So what happens is he sits there and he talks about, how conflicted he is. It is east and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. So he's saying, Juliet is extremely beautiful. She's extremely fair. She's someone that I'm completely infatuated with. But once again, there is somewhat of a tension, of an anxiety within this kind of infatuation, which is really going to get drawn out in this upcoming conversation between Romeo and Juliet. Obviously, because their love is not something that is sanctioned well by either family, there is a great deal of stress on both sides about whether or not it will actually work out. Okay, so Juliet just happens to appear right above where Romeo is hiding, and she begins talking to herself, not knowing Romeo is there. Romeo replies with, I am too bold, 'tis not to me she speaks. Two of the fairest stars in all the heaven having some business do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. So she starts monologuing to herself, and Romeo, he's so love-stricken. He says, oh, she's not talking to me, she's talking to someone else, and then has this really flowery language to describe her. All the twinkling stars of the sky are like her eyes and things like that, okay? So obviously he's extremely love-stricken, and once again, it's meant to be a little exaggerated. It's meant to be a little over the top. It's not necessarily meant to be a realistic depiction of what love is like. So we're meant to take a little bit of humor from it, but also kind of be wooed by his words. But what happens is actually, Juliet is referring to Romeo, okay? Romeo, thinks this whole time he's very insecure. She's not talking to me. Juliet says, oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Okay, that's one of the most famous lines in the play. Don't really understand why. It's obviously the beginning of their kind of romance, but really all she's saying is, where are you, Romeo? I don't really understand why it has such big impact, but I think the next couple lines make it a little more clear. Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. Okay, so she says, she's kind of, not regretting, but she's really conflicted in herself. She's like, if I love Romeo, then therefore I'm denying my own name. I'm denying where I came from. I'm denying my family. Why? Because my family would condemn me for doing this. So if I fall in love with Romeo, I'm no longer a Capulet. Okay, that's what she thinks to herself. And Romeo, he's conflicting whether or not he should talk to her at all. Juliet keeps talking. What's a Montague? Now, this kind of almost reflects some of the sentiments that were going on in A Merchant of Venice. Okay, The Merchant of Venice, where, Shylock's whole speech about hath a Jew not eyes, right? Hath a Jew not, feelings, okay? Juliet, at this point, is kind of talking once again about these arbitrary distinctions between people, okay? That's kind of what Shylock was getting at in that particular play as well. There are some arbitrary distinctions between people that people discriminate each other on. And Juliet is kind of getting to the same point. She says, what is a Montague? What's a Montague? It is nor hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man. Oh, be some other name. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. Okay, so what she's saying is, really at the end of the day, what defines a person by family is kind of just their name, right? She says that, we can call a rose, but we could also call it, anything else, a jollop or whatever. I made up that word, and it would still smell as sweet. It would still be a rose. It would still be the same thing. Okay, what defines a man should be, his arms, his legs, his personality, what he's like. Okay, not his name. So once again, Juliet is kind of appealing to that kind of humanistic approach to philosophy, humanistic approach to perspective that Shakespeare includes in many, many of his plays. Okay, so she's taking a particular approach of refocusing on what defines us as people and not what things like, tradition, family, religion, fate, our empire, our kingdom, those things define in people. It's what actually defines us. So Romeo and Juliet then begin talking. Okay, first Juliet doesn't know who it is that's talking to her, and then she realizes it's Romeo. Then they basically have this really, really prolonged exchange where they not only basically talk about their love for each other, which is quite sappy and quite cheesy, as you've probably considered by this point or realized by this point, but there's also a great deal of anxiety and tension within this particular conversation. And what I mean by that is they are so afraid of loving each other that they're not that they're unsure, but they're very hesitant to really commit themselves at this point, right? So, for example, Romeo says, "Lady, by yonder blessed moon I vow, that tips with silver all these fruit treetops," and Juliet suddenly interrupts him, "Oh, swear not by the moon, the inconsistent moon that monthly changes in her circled orb, lest that thy love probe likewise variable." Romeo answers, "What shall I swear by?" And Juliet says, "Do not swear at all, or if thou wilt, swear by thy gracious self, which is the god of my idolatry." So what she's basically saying at this point, or what they're conveying here, is how unsure that their love is actually going to last, okay? So they are completely head over heels for one another, but obviously due to their social circumstance, due to the sort of condition that their families and the tradition has placed them under, they are very unsure of whether it's going to happen at all. And when Romeo begins to swear by the moon, Juliet says, "Don't do that, okay? The moon changes every night. I don't want your love to change like that as well. If anything, swear by yourself. Be a human being and basically just hold yourself accountable to your words." So there is a kind of strange mixture of feelings going on at this point, okay? Now, not often in love stories do you get this kind of conflicted, really fearful love that we see in Romeo and Juliet, okay? The kind of stereotypical love story is a couple of people fall in love, it's really cute, it's really sweet, you know, they might have small arguments or problems, but ultimately, you know, they are fine, okay? They ultimately fall in love and they get married, etc., etc. But how Romeo and Juliet begins is the characters realize they can't love each other, or they ought not to, okay? Society or their family tells them that they ought not to love each other, but they can't help themselves. They do. They can't control it. They just do, okay? So that is a particularly interesting part of Romeo and Juliet that might be worth thinking a little bit about, especially as we move forward. Anyway, Romeo and Juliet then agree to meet at the next day at a certain time, okay, and Juliet ends with quite a moving speech. "'Tis almost morning, I would have thee gone, and yet no farther than a wanton's bird that lets it hop a little from his hand, like a poor prisoner in his twisted gyves, and with a silken thread plucks it back again, so loving jealous of his liberty." So she kind of comes up with this metaphor of their love as a bird locked in a cage, okay? So close to freedom, okay? Just the tiniest bit away from freedom. They can see the outside world, and yet they're locked in by this cage that they cannot and they do not have the power to escape. So it's quite a moving image, and it's quite almost like a depressing image to end this particular scene. Cool. Let's move on to Act 2, Scene 3, where we meet for the first time one of the most important characters in the play, and that is Friar Lawrence. Now, Friar Lawrence is the voice of reason, like the strongest and the clearest voice of reason by far in the play, okay? We have a bunch of characters in this play that are motivated by violence, motivated by love, motivated by loyalty. Friar Lawrence is kind of that middle ground. He's very, very clear-headed, even-minded, and he doesn't get overly emotional about things. He assesses things as they are, and he tries to assess things fairly. That's because he's not only basically a horticulturalist, someone who grows plants, but he's also a friar. He's a pastor. He's someone who teaches religion, and he's someone who can marry people, okay? He's that kind of priestly role. So he kind of has to have that kind of even-headedness. And what's interesting about Friar Lawrence is he is the person who rebukes the most in the play. And what I mean by that is he is the one who is there to keep, especially Romeo, in check when bad things happen, okay? So when Romeo gets too overly emotional, he is there to say, "Romeo, what are you doing, buddy? You shouldn't be getting this emotional," and we'll see that in later parts of the play. He's there to really lay down what's important and what's not, and he's really, really a clear, guiding figure, and almost like a fatherly figure to Romeo. So, Friar Lawrence opens Act 2, Scene 3 with quite a long, not a soliloquy, but a speech where no one else is in the room yet, and he talks a little bit about growing plants, and he kind of likens, or there's kind of a simile between growing plants and the way human beings are and the way the nature of love is, as a kind of conflicted thing, because he says, "I have so many plants, some of them heal, but some of them can kill as well. Some of them have poison in them." And in a way, that's also kind of like how humanity is. There are some good people, but there are some that are quite evil. He says around line 15, "In plants, herbs, stones, and their true qualities, for naught so vile that on earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give, nor aught so good, but strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice sometime by action dignified. This, once again, brings in almost another little element or another little idea, which is the idea that, well, some people are good and evil, but they're kind of, maybe they're justified in wrong ways, okay? So what he means by that is sometimes you can do something nasty, or sometimes you can do something that would conventionally be considered nasty if it's for the greater good, if it has some sort of moral justification. Whereas some people who are too traditionally good, loyal, faithful, etc., might actually end up doing harm. Once again, this brings in another layer of complexity to the whole inner conflict, inner paradox type theme that's been running throughout Act 1. Act 2, Scene 3 now, we kind of have this another kind of perspective on the entire issue where, yeah, sure, you can be conflicted, but sometimes the conflict is also conflicted, right? Because sometimes what you think is good might be bad, and what you think is bad might actually be good in the long run. Anyway, Act 2, Scene 3, what happens is Romeo busts in, okay? Friar Lawrence says, oh, you look rather happy, okay? Is it because you've finally gotten your chance with Rosaline? Romeo says, no, I don't love her anymore, okay? Which Friar Lawrence immediately begins rebuking him, okay? Immediately begins criticizing him for what seems to be a too sudden change of heart. Friar Lawrence says, Holy St. Francis, what a change is here! Is Rosaline that thou didst love so dear, so soon forsaken? Young men's love then lies, not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. Jesu Maria, what a deal of brine hath washed thy sallow cheeks for Rosaline. Okay, so he's saying, hang on, I saw you literally weeks ago crying and crying for Rosaline, but suddenly it's gone, okay? He says, young men, these fickle, teenagers, when they fall in love, they don't really fall in love with their heart, they just fall in love with what's pretty to them, what's beautiful to them. They fall in love with their eyes, okay? So he's saying, Romeo is not really faithful. He's not really true to himself. He's not really true to heart. He kind of just, follows line by line, follows his daily events, and if he happens to run into a cuter girl, then he'll just fall in love with her, okay? And art thou changed? Pronounce this sentence then, women may fall when there's no strength in men, okay? So he's, once again, and this theme might be a little problematic in the current day, and we're going to talk about this more in Act 3 when it becomes more prominent, but there's this whole idea of gender essentiality and gender roles, okay? So things like what men are meant to be like, what women are meant to be like. Friar Lawrence, while he's the voice of reason, is also kind of an essentialist, which is not really a good thing, especially in the modern day. We're going to talk more about that later, but he kind of has this idea that women should be like such and such and men should be like such and such, and he kind of criticizes Romeo for being fickle when men are meant to be really strong, really determined, really stable in who they are. Romeo says, please don't chide me, please don't rebuke me any further. I need you to marry me and this girl, okay? And basically, Friar Lawrence agrees, if only by the chance that, Romeo and Juliet marrying might finally bring some peace to Verona. Act 2, Scene 4, and almost basically the rest of the act is not particularly important. So at the start of Act 2, Scene 4, there is quite a bit of conflict between Mercutio, Benvolio, and Romeo. So there's lots of sexual joking. It gets almost quite extreme at points. I don't think there's much particularly worth close analysis, but it's worth a read. Some of it is a little bit funny. We keep going on. Nurse comes in, and Mercutio jokes at the nurse in a sexual way. Mercutio is a real kind of out there character, okay? He's very much a very crude, a very bawdy, a very uncivilized type. And he kind of represents almost that servant class as well. Obviously not like a nurse, but he's obviously less rich and privileged than maybe a Montague, and certainly very much less so than a Capulet. So what happens? Okay, the nurse comes in, the nurse tries to find Romeo, Mercutio keeps jesting at them, and Romeo says, a gentleman nurse that loves to hear himself talk and will speak more in a minute than he will stand in a month. Okay, so he's basically saying, look, Mercutio, he's just a joker. He's a complete jester. He doesn't really mean anything he says, and he shouldn't be taken seriously. Now, what's quite interesting and something that I didn't really bring up in the previous video is the speeches or the talking of the nurse. Now, as I'm sure you've realized, what's quite weird is some particular parts of the play, characters will talk in shorter lines and almost rhyming lines, and then some characters will just talk in like complete paragraphs. And I'm sure I brought this up before and in a previous play, but basically Shakespeare switches the style of his language depending on which character is talking in order to reflect some part of them. For the characters that are more upper class, for the characters that are more prim and polished and civilized, they'll talk usually in some sort of rhyming or iambic pentameter, okay? So they'll talk in a very metered, poetic way, whereas the nurse, when she's talking with other people, she's literally talking in sentences, right? Full English sentences. She's not talking in this kind of poetic style. And that's meant to represent class a little bit. There's an argument to be had about whether or not that's a little bit, prejudice or depicting these characters in the wrong way, or depicting these characters by making, the audience feel like, these poor characters are bad. But once again, it's meant to reflect the times. It's meant to reflect the attitudes of Shakespeare's society. Act 2, Scene 5, okay? Nurse finds Romeo, says, do you want to get married with her? Romeo says, yes, obviously, okay. Tell Juliet to meet me at Friar Lawrence's, okay. Then Nurse goes back to Juliet. She's kind of like this in-between messenger, as I mentioned in Act 1 video. And Juliet says, Nurse goes on and on and on about her back pain. Juliet says, tell me, what's his news? Once again, I think this highlights a particular difference in the interests of different classes, right? So the nurse is very much kind of concerned, has issues with her physical health, has issues with her employment, how much money she makes. Those are the physical, material concerns of the lower class that don't even affect kind of richer people. And I think that's quite interesting because it depicts the social class contrast as being really wide. And whereas Juliet is just desperate, does Romeo love me, doesn't want to get married with me, it almost seems a little bit silly and over the top compared to the more worldly concerns of the nurse, right? Because Juliet is just so infatuated with this boy that she met at a party that she's dying to know about their marriage details and things like that. And even the whole question of marriage seems a little bit absurd, right? Because they've only met for like a few hours and they're already deciding to be husband and wife. Obviously, we can bring up questions about whether that's appropriate or, good or not. So, yeah. All right, let's keep going. Act 2, Scene 6. What happens is, finally, Nurse conveys marriage to Juliet. They get married. They go to Friar Lawrence's cell. And Friar Lawrence has a speech that is particularly foreboding and particularly foreshadowing. And this is where the idea of fate really comes into play. And it's going to come into play throughout the rest of the play, which is the idea of, no matter how much we as human beings try to overcome fate, no matter how much, humanistic Shakespeare is about, having free will and things like that, ultimately maybe fate has some role in our lives, okay? So Friar Lawrence says, these violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder, which as their kiss consume. The sweetest honey is loathsome in his own deliciousness, and in the taste confounds the appetite. Therefore love moderate, long love doth so. The context that he's saying this in is basically he's giving advice to these lovers, and he's saying don't be too intense with each other, don't burn yourselves out. You want to love for a long time, so be careful. But really, it kind of foreshadows that maybe something bad will happen. These violent delights have violent ends. And if anyone's read to the end of Romeo and Juliet, you kind of know what happens. Or if you know, the tale of Pyramus and Thisbe, which I said was related to Romeo and Juliet, you also kind of know what happens, okay? So once again, he's creating this tension in the reader's mind. Once again, okay, Romeo and Juliet get married, and Juliet, who is, remember, the kind of richest character or the richest family in this particular play, the Capulets are depicted as wildly, audacious with their spending and wildly kind of rich. Juliet says, they are but beggars that can count their worth, but my true love is grown to such excess I cannot sum up some of half my wealth. Okay, so she's saying that my love is so great for Romeo that it was larger than even half of all the money I earn, which is a little bit of a strange way to convey love, but once again, brings back that idea of social class into the discussion, brings back that idea of like these rich people kind of having a completely different way of viewing the world than people like Friar Lawrence, or even people like Romeo, who is slightly less bourgeois than Juliet is. And that wraps up Act 2. I'll see you next time for Act 3.